Welcome to the pre-work introduction to our new first edition by Coates, The Matrix of Race, Social Construction, Intersectionality, and Inequality. This book is for the Introduction to Race and Ethnic Relations course. It is one of the largest courses within the sociology discipline right after Intro Sociology. About 350,000 students take this course each year, and it can be found at both the 2-year and 4-year levels. As we've talked about before, the Race and Ethnicity course is part of a larger Inequalities cluster, which contains many different course names. For Coates, we really want to target courses very focused on race and race relations specifically. So these course titles would include Race and Ethnic Relations, Race and Ethnicity, Race Relations, and Race and Racism. This is generally a freshman or sophomore level course and is taught by sociology instructors who specialize in race, ethnicity, class, and/or gender studies. The authors of this book are Rodney Coates, Abby Ferber, and David Brunsma. All three are very well networked and well known within the field. They also represent a new and very contemporary way of looking at race and racism in society today, and that new outlook highly influenced their writing of this text. These authors are definitely part of a new generation of scholars who are looking at and presenting these topics in a different way. Let's take a look at the book's unique value proposition. What does make it unique? The Matrix of Race is a textbook that helps make race and racial inequality visible in new ways to all students in race and ethnic relations courses, regardless of their backgrounds. This includes minorities who may have experienced the impact of race in their own lives, as well as members of dominant groups who might believe that we now live in a colorblind society and that race and racism are relics of the past. In order to accomplish this, the authors talk a lot about intersectionality and privilege and how these two ideas affect race and racism. Intersectionality is the idea that race is embedded within all of a person's socially constructed categories of difference, such as their ethnicity, gender, social class, and sexuality. All these different elements of a person affect their idea of race. Here is author Rodney Coates on how he defines intersectionality.
We have conversations about race or gender or class or even age groups. Equally often, we have debates over what's more salient, what's more important, one's racial identity or one's gender or one's age. The problem with these conversations is that we cannot slice and dice our identities. We cannot segment ourselves and say, today I'm racial, tomorrow I am a gender, and in this setting I'm going to be aged. No, we take all of these identities with us no matter where we go. So therefore, I am a black male of a particular age, middle class, definitely, college professor. My experiences are radically different than, say, a welfare mother who happens to be Hispanic living in a place like New York City. That is what we mean by intersectionality. And we recognize that these intersectional differences that come into being and help define our identities are also impacted upon by places like geography and also institutional spaces.
The second main idea emphasized throughout this text is that of privilege. This is the idea that there are two sides to racism. One is the person that is discriminated against, or disadvantaged, or oppressed. The other is the advantaged person, or the person in a place of privilege. The authors talk about the fact that both are harmful in their own way, and that both can be experienced simultaneously. In other words, no one person is always the oppressed person, and no one person is always privileged. We're going to dig deeper into the meaning of the matrix in the in-person session, but generally, the matrix in the title refers to a way of thinking about race that helps readers get beyond the familiar us versus them arguments that can lead to resistance and hostility. In this book, the authors look at race and racism through various lenses and stress the following key points. Race is socially constructed. It changes from one place to another and across time. Also, when talking about racial inequality, it's more useful to focus on the structures of society or the institutions that we operate within rather than to blame individuals. And lastly, there's the idea that we are all active agents in maintaining or challenging the matrix of race. Here's a clip of Rodney Coates on what the matrix means to him.
When we use the term the matrix, we start with, at the core, our identity, our racial identity, which is the dominant social construction that impacts upon many aspects of our existence. We recognize that within that racial identity, we are a particular gender, particular class group, particular age group. Those are what we mean by intersectionality. Now, these intersectional identities, they exist in particular historical periods of time. So therefore, being black, male, middle class of my age group is radically different than my father's generation 30, 40 years ago, or his father's generation 50 years before that. This recognizes that time and the sequence of time impacts upon how these identities are formed. Along with time is geographical spaces. So individuals existing in places like Georgia, the South, Mississippi, versus the Midwest or the East Coast, West Coast, at this particular time, or 30 years ago or 40 years ago, had radically different experiences because of that geographical space. The last element of the matrix recognizes that these identities operate within a set of institutional structures, such as family, such as the economy, such as education or military or sports. And tracking these identities, intersectional identities across time, across space, and across institutions helps us to understand why the matrix and how the matrix applies to our lives.
One way the authors go about getting beyond the traditional us versus them mentality is through their organization of the content. Traditionally, there have been two ways today's books organize their table of contents. Older texts use a categorical or group by group approach and feature a series of chapters that examine one minority group at a time. They'll look at Native Americans and then African Americans and then Latino Americans, Asian Americans, etc. Newer texts, designed within the last 5 to 10 years, are more likely to be organized topically, like the Coates book on the right. These books discuss how race operates within the major institutions that structure our social lives, such as families, the healthcare system, the education system, or the legal and criminal justice systems. One strong case against the group by group approach on the left is that many students may identify strongly with only one particular group. Those students may feel highly engaged and participate during discussions of the group they identify with most, but could become disengaged during the discussions of other groups. In looking at each race within the context of the larger institutions, Coates has a way of helping students answer the question, what does it mean to me, when different racial groups and their experiences are discussed. They're able to see what's relevant to them in every chapter. One last key difference in Coates is its inclusion and discussion of 4 story types in each chapter. The story types are derived from a popular book, Storytelling for Social Justice, by educator and activist Leanne Bell, and they provide a model for analyzing stories about race. Bell argues that there are essentially 4 kinds of stories that we all encounter in our lives. Those are stock, concealed, resistance, and transforming stories. Stock stories are the tales told by the dominant group, but they're often embraced by those whose oppression they reinforce. They inform and organize the practices of social institutions and are encoded in our laws, public policy, public space, history, and culture. Stock stories are the dominant stories we hear most often and rarely think to challenge. Concealed stories consist of the data and voices that stock stories ignore, and often convey a very different understanding of identity and inequality. In the case of concealed stories, we explore questions like, what are the stories about race and racism that we don't hear? Why don't we hear them? Why are such stories left out? And what do these stories show us about racism that stock stories do not? Resistance stories are narratives that directly challenge stock stories. They speak of defying domination and actively struggling for racial justice and social change. And lastly, transforming stories. Once we examine concealed and resistance stories, we can use them to write transforming stories that guide our actions as we work towards creating a more just society. These stories look at questions like, what would it look like if we transformed the stock stories? What can we draw from resistance stories to create new stories about what ought to be? And what kinds of stories can support our ability to speak out and act where instances of racism occur? Here's a grid which shows the competition within the race and ethnicity market. On the left, you'll find the more traditional books which utilize the group-by-group organization. This includes our Healy books, Race, Ethnicity, Gender and Class, and Diversity in Society, as well as the best-selling Schaeffer and Perillo texts. On the right are the books organized by theme or concept, like our Coates book. We will dig deeper into competition during the in-person session, but for now, you can note that the main competitors for Coates will be Desmond from Norton, Golash Boza from Oxford, and Fitzgerald from Westview. This has been an introduction to the Coates book. As you prepare for the main in-person session, we hope you keep these 4 takeaways in mind. First, Coates has a strong focus on intersectionality, or the fact that race is embedded within all of a person's socially constructed categories of difference, such as their ethnicity, gender, social class, and sexuality. Second, the authors introduce the idea of privilege and the fact that there are 2 sides to racism, those that are oppressed and those that are privileged. Third, that the chapters in Coates are organized thematically rather than group by group. And lastly, that there are 4 story types which are revisited in each chapter: stock, concealed, resistance, and transforming stories. We look forward to seeing you at the sales meeting and digging even deeper into this exciting new offering.